I am Amy Vetter, and welcome to the Breaking Beliefs podcast. This valuable time is for you to pause in your day and go on your own self-journey. Discover the beliefs that are holding you back from living your best life at work and at home. Learn from the guests on this show as they share their inspirational stories on how they found ways to break internal beliefs that were no longer serving them. Because if you believe you can, you will. And our podcast begins now. Welcome to this episode of Breaking Beliefs, where I interview Allen Lloyd. Allen is the Executive Director of Montana Society of CPAs, where he is responsible to work with his members and board to move forward the mission of the organization. He manages the staff and makes sure that efforts are focused on his mission to inspire, empower, and impact their members to achieve professional excellence. During this interview, we discuss his background growing up in a small town and how that has helped him accept life as it is. He also shares his leadership lessons that he learned along the way as an executive assistant that he learned from CEOs and partners that helped shape him today. I'm so excited for you to listen to this interview on how Allen created belief systems from the people around him, his family, and leaders throughout his career. And that is what my new book, Disconnect to Connect, Tap into the Power Within You to Create the Life You Desire, is all about. I hope you join the journey and sign up for the exciting events we have coming up around my new book, as well as purchase my new book on Amazon, available April 25th. Welcome to this episode of Breaking Beliefs. I am very excited today to be interviewing Allen Lloyd. And Allen, did you want to just start off and give us a little background on yourself?
Yeah, my name is Allen Lloyd. I am currently Executive Director of the Montana Society of CPAs. Prior to joining the Montana Society, I worked for 7 years at the Ohio Society, and then prior to that, I spent about 7 years at a regional accounting firm after graduating with a business administration degree. So I took 2 accounting classes in college. I hated both of them, and now I've spent the majority of my working life in the accounting profession.
Yeah, awesome. Well, and I'm a current board member on Ohio Society, so definitely would love to hear as you kind of grew through those channels. So that's awesome. Ohio Society's been awesome. They're really engaged in the profession, so it's been fun to be a part of that. So, all right, well, let's get started. So you're part of the Montana Society. Where did you actually grow up? Where are you from?
So I always tell the story. I was born in Massachusetts. My dad was in the Navy, and then he was a long haul truck driver after that. And so I was born in Massachusetts. We moved when I was, I think, a year old. So my only recollection is my dad and I would go back golfing in the summers growing up. I say that because his best friend was this guy named Fonzie, and I always thought Fonzie was the guy from Happy Days, but no, there's actually a guy out there that's his name. So we moved to West Virginia, where all my family is from, and then I think when I was 4 or 5, we moved to Ohio, but just barely. So I grew up right on the Ohio River, a tiny little town called Clarington. I think there are 300 people that live there now. My parents still live in the house where I grew up. You can see the Ohio River in West Virginia from their front porch.
So why did they decide to move to Ohio?
My dad got a job. So my dad has an interesting story. He was in the Navy, and then he took the GI Bill to get an engineering degree, and he was one of the first people that did CAD. And so he worked at a chemical plant that literally had 1 million miles of pipe. So these chemicals are just going back and forth everywhere. And all they had were the original engineer's drawings. And so if something started to leak, they wouldn't know what it was. Like, they didn't know what was in every tube. They had to go back to the drawing, find the page and be like, that's bad stuff, stay away. Or, oh yeah, it's fine, go ahead and fix it. And so my dad spent a number of years just converting all of those hand-drawn things into CAD files.
Oh, wow.
And then he became a consultant after that because he had this knowledge on something that was, highly valuable but quite scarce.
Yeah, I'll say. And
Yeah.
so, but you said he was a truck driver as well. So what was the transition there?
That was kind of like the in between. And so he drove truck I think he was doing it while he was going back to school,
Oh, wow.
which is even more difficult.
Yeah, I'll say, especially if it's long haul.
Yeah.
There wasn't virtual at the time.
Yeah.
So, and then your mom, what did she do?
Yeah, my mom is a school teacher. And so my mom,
What grade?
so she taught home ec in a rural middle and high school in Ohio. And it's funny because she has two brothers who are also both teachers.
Wow. Okay. Home ec was my worst class. Like you had to make a dress. We had to sew a dress, and I did not know how to sew. And then you had to wear the dress one day to school, like once you made it. And the whole day, like I felt something pricking at me and I was ignoring it. And then I got home from school and I like plopped down on the couch. I'm like, ow. I never took the needle out.
So the funny thing, my mom was a home ec teacher, and growing up, my mom taught in the public school system, and as a result of that, my parents sent me to a private school, and so I never took home ec. And so, even when I was in college, cooking and sewing to this day, like I still don't like to cook, and I have no idea how to sew.
That's funny.
Yeah.
She was like, at home, I don't want to deal with this.
Well,
like,
she
I'm done.
all of those things. She was an expert in all of those things.
Oh, right.
I didn't have to do any of it.
Yeah, that's. Did you have siblings?
No, I'm an only child.
Oh, okay. So, so maybe how did your parents meet?
My parents, my grandparents lived across the street from each other.
Oh, okay.
Grew up on the same street in this rural town in West Virginia. And the fun part about it is when they were in high school, they were really good friends, but they dated other people. And so what they do is they go out on a date and then they'd come home at the end of the night and they'd go and they'd talk to each other about the dates they went on. And then eventually, they kind of figured out, hey, we should stop dating these other people. We're built for each other.
Oh, that's awesome. What a great story.
Yeah,
so
it always made holidays interesting though, because from either grandparents' house, you could see the other one. And so you couldn't just go to one, you had to go to both, or else they'd be like, what are you doing over there?
Exactly. Oh my gosh. And so why did your dad decide to go into the Navy? Like, what was that? Were they already married at that point, or?
So when they got married, this is fun because I chronologically I'm trying to remember here. When they got married, my dad was in uniform, so he must have been in the Navy when they got married.
Okay, yeah. So what did you, having someone that's been in the military as your father, and also engineering is a very analytical mind as well, and probably orderly. So what was that like growing up with your dad? What did you learn from it, and what things have you kept from that as well?
So I kind of share that very hyper organized mentality. Engineering is also problem solving, and so there's a lot of that I probably more often than not, I'm that classic person that if you want to tell me a story, I'm going to tell you how to fix things at the end, because that's just how my mind works. And I think the other one is just, a lot of the, as running an organization, a lot of times you have to think a few steps ahead.
Hmm.
And I remember, I learned the game of, my dad taught me the game of golf. And, it's hilarious. We always joke that when they send us on a golf course, they need to make sure it's got a full battery because he hits the ball left, I hit the ball right. And so growing up, there were, my dad he would get frustrated. He'd be like, look, the ball's going to do this. And that you've got to get there in 3 shots, so why don't you try to go over there knowing it'll land there? And just, I think there's some strategy there and thinking, hey, here are my limitations and I need to recognize them and work around them, which has been very like it's one of those things that just naturally I do these days.
Right. That you don't even realize when those things sink in, right? That you start referring back to it. Yeah. So what were your hobbies when you were younger?
Biking. I grew up, a tiny little town, that classic. It had a main drag. By the time I was growing up, the highway had, bypassed it, so you didn't really have to worry about getting run over. But growing up in the summer, I would just ride my bike back and forth. And the town I think is 3 miles from end to end.
Oh, wow.
And so there's not a lot of you see the same area a whole bunch. And I still I still bike to this day. I think the other things are basketball and golf. Growing up, my best friend Sean and I would just play hours and hours of basketball at his house.
Yeah. So what did you learn from growing up in a small town that you think you still keep with you today?
Um, Probably the biggest thing is just appreciating things moving slower. And so, I like to say I spent the first 20 years of my life, on the Ohio River. I spent my second 20 years in Columbus, Ohio. And in those 20 years when I was in Columbus, it ballooned. And so I remember when, I went to college at Otterbein, when you drove around the north side of the city there was a lot of farmland, and now that's developments of malls. And I think that, at a certain point in life, you're either built for that or you're not. I think we discovered that that pace, moving to Helena, which I guess for a point of reference for somebody from Ohio, Helena is like the size of Zanesville. Okay.
Yeah.
But it's a state capital. But just the pace of things here is, rush hour lasts like 20 minutes.
Yeah.
It's nothing. But just realizing the appreciation for that, I think is huge. And then just community, I think it's one of those things where I still struggle, not just inherently, trusting, and like our kid, I have 2 boys, they're pretty much free range, they go about and do what they want and, kind of have their own adventures. And I think that's something that, had we stayed in Columbus, there would have been some times where that would have been more difficult to do and not be overly nervous.
Yeah, absolutely. So, so let's talk about a little. So you got into college, which is, so how did that, what did you want to be when you grew up? So that we can figure out the transition to where you are today.
So, quite frankly, I had no idea what I wanted to be when I grew up. When I was a kid, I wanted to be a fighter pilot. Okay. And then there was a guy in our town who had been a fighter pilot. And, one afternoon I was like talking to him and he's showing me all these things. And I'm like, this is what I want to do. And he goes, sorry, kid, it's not going to happen. I'm like, what are you talking about? He's like, your glasses. There are fighter pilots with glasses just don't exist. And at that point I was just kind of like,
Oh,
damn, these plans I've made, Top Gun, that was going to be me. And no, it's not. And so I think, in high school, so I went to a private school. And my last 3 years, I was a boarding student, so I lived in the dorm. And the guy that ran our dorm, Mr. Plumby, he was also my business class teacher, and I really enjoyed. A lot of it was just basic economics, supply and demand stuff. But like I really just latched onto that, and so when I was looking at colleges, I wanted to go somewhere and just kind of study business in general. And so I ended up with a business administration major, which the nice thing about business administration major is you don't really take any of the like 400 level classes.
Right.
Just do like 200 and 300 level across all the disciplines.
Everything.
And so it's like a undergrad MBA of sorts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so what were you thinking to do with that? Like what was your goal?
So I think, as I always remind myself of this when I go on college campuses, that, a lot of students, even when they're in college, they still have no idea what like the real world is about or like.
Right.
And so, yeah, I just was like, I'm going to do business things, where do you think that means? And so luckily when I graduated college, my good friend Trisha, her mom worked at Huntington Bank, and she was like, well, I'm hiring, do you have anything? And I'm like, no, I don't have a job. And so she gave me an application, and I fill out the application, I submit it, and I go in
and just with that, like think of how different the world was.
Yeah.
I mean, we've had Boyd on talking about this and others of just like if you screwed up anything on sending that application in, or like he didn't put the right phone number, or he had screwed up a digit, like he wasn't getting any responses and he didn't know why. But it's so different than these days going on job boards, and it was hard to find. You had to literally walk into places and give your application.
Well, yeah, and like mine was handwritten. Like the first job out of college I hand wrote. And so the funny story is, Tina hires me. It was compliance for car loans and leases, and so it was, glorified data entry at best. But about 6 months in, she kind of pulls me aside and she's like, "Yeah, you're doing a really good job. I was this close to just not even hiring you." Because you couldn't even fill out the application correctly. And I was like, what are you talking about? And so I'm a junior. My dad has the same name, right?
Yeah.
And so growing up, all my high school and college friends know me as Lloyd, because if you call our house and you ask for Allen, you got my dad. And so
Right.
I defaulted to Lloyd. And so when she got my application, she knew me because, one of my best college friends was her, daughter. And she had always known me as Lloyd. And so she was like, you couldn't even get your names in the right boxes. I'm like, I got that right. You just never knew.
Oh my God, that's hilarious.
Yeah.
So how long did you work there, and what was your job?
I think I worked there for 3 years. And so I left when Tina left. One of the things that always drove Tina nuts was she was the manager. And I learned, this is one of those early like business lessons I learned. She was salary, and then all of us that reported to her were hourly. And so I think in the 3 years that we worked together, 2 of those years I made more money than she made.
Yeah.
Because I was getting paid for all these hours we were putting in, and she just wasn't.
Right.
But she left, and so it was bank compliance work, which I think a lot of that has been automated away, thank God. But it's just looking and going, okay, did they put the right number in the right place? Does the math work out? Stuff like that.
It's funny, my son, they have a school bank at his high school, and he's the president of the bank, and they still are doing all that manually because they don't have the automation, or could invest in that for like school lunch money that they're putting in there or whatever, but they're doing all the banking functions. And it's funny to see everything manual again, like and him complaining about like different things that they're doing.
But you learn so much from that too,
Exactly.
Like,
The math before the calculator.
Yeah, if the computer just does it, you don't even have to think about it. But we still have to think about it a lot. And so So Tina left. She went to this place called Sky Financial. And I followed. We did bank compliance there. It was commercial lending only to dentists. So dentists are number 2 behind funeral homes, least likely businesses to go under. You've got a big capital investment. Everybody has to have their teeth cleaned. And so I think I spent 3 years there. It was a very sales-driven organization. And so being in compliance at a sales organization is not the best. But the commissions were really good. And so I remember the last year I was there, I switched over to a sales assistant role. And my salary got cut in half, but my take home, I think, was almost triple. And I knew I was tired of it. So I just said, look, I'm saving every dollar I can. And I think probably like July or August, I told my boss, I'm like, January 1st, I'm out. I'm leaving. And they're like, where are you going? I'm like, I have no idea. But I was like, I'm making enough money. And so I had built up, enough money to kind of, not work for a little while, which was fantastic. And then, at the point where I needed to get a job again, I was just, applying anything I could find. And the accounting firm, Norman Jones and Lowe, they were looking for an executive assistant, somebody to be, the partner's gopher essentially. And I remember the day I started, like everybody looked at me and they were like, you don't look like any of the assistants they've had before. And I'm like, I haven't met any of them. And so like a guy, like a executive assistant that was a man at that point was kind of I remember my first tax season there. We had this client, he owned like a novelty goods store. And he came in and our managing partner like didn't have time for him. And he's like, here, can you just give him this stuff? And so I go out to meet with this guy and I go, hey, I'm Andy's assistant. And he gives this look. He's like, what? I'm like, yeah, I'm Andy's assistant. He goes, does he kiss you? And I was like,
oh my gosh.
And I was like, take your stuff. And I remember going back and being like, that was really weird. And he's like, yeah, but he's a great client. So
all these things would not be accepted today.
Well, yeah.
Why would you make an assumption that he would kiss a woman if it was an assistant?
Exactly. And like I remember even at the time, it was like this is nuts. I can't believe somebody would actually say that, but
it's unbelievable. Yeah. Yeah, I remember like when I started, and it was the same thing. It's just it's amazing though. I mean, this is like 25 years ago or something, but you'd think it was like even longer ago. But being Jewish in a Midwestern town, there weren't as many Jews, and clients would make anti-Semitic remarks all the time. And the managers would be like, don't say anything. Like, we can't lose this client. And it's like, you're biting your tongue and smile. Like, you're just like, and now there's no way, like it's unbelievable. And you could never have a manager that told you like not to protect yourself. That wouldn't be acceptable in the workplace. Like just how far we've come. And even though there's so much to go, it's sometimes we forget just so recent, like how people just weren't accepting, or protected to be accepted.
Yep. Well, I always, whenever diversity comes up, the first Black person I ever talked to. So I'm at this private school, and at the time I'm a day student, so I get dropped off before school, and I'm sitting in the hallway, and I was working on my math homework, and I was clearly like, I'm not good at math to begin with, but something was clearly like challenging me. And so I'm sitting there, next to my locker, and this guy Dwight walks by and he looks down and he goes, hey kid, do you need help? And I was like, I don't know, maybe. And so, I looked back at the yearbook and he was like 6'4". And so like, super intimidating guy. And I remember the feeling of having a little bit of fear. And he sat down next to me. And he, I'd been, whatever this math was, I'd been going to class all week to learn this, and it just wasn't sinking in. Within like 2 minutes, he's explained it to me and I understood it. And at that point I was like, wow, I didn't instinctively go, oh, Black person is a math teacher.
Yeah.
But I was
Yeah.
like, this is just a person just like me.
Exactly.
And I had a very similar experience when I went to Otterbein. I was a business major. My freshman year, the school in its infinite wisdom paired me up with a theater major as my roommate. Otterbein has a very good theater program. And so I don't know, maybe a month into being in college, I met somebody that was gay, and I had met him before and I had no idea. And then one day, he was talking about going out with somebody, and I was like, "Are you gay?" He's like, "Yeah." I was like, "Huh." And again, it was one of those moments where it was like, yeah, just a normal person, just like me, just
Yeah.
different in that one little way. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, and so
Yeah. And you don't grow up in areas where it's diverse, those are the things, over time of just making sure to break free from anything you heard, and
yeah,
preconceived notions are so important, because I don't think a lot of times people even realize they're repeating something that someone else said to them, but do they really believe it,
yeah.
and make sure they test it. Yeah.
Well, and how many of those people repeat those things having never had an experience with somebody?
Right, exactly. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so okay, so you're with the accounting firm, and then how did you get to the Ohio Society from there?
So we were a firm with 7 partners, and our managing partner and kind of the next managing partner, they didn't get along, and so I was always stuck in the middle. It was literally one of those, "Will you go tell him I said this?" And I remember one point being like, I can't do this anymore." I left and I spent 2 years at the Mid Ohio Regional Planning Commission. Uh,
Mm,
Government work is not for me. I can't do it.
yeah.
Learned that lesson pretty quickly. But again, I was the CEO's assistant. And so I was just looking for a job. And Clark Price from the Ohio Society, he was looking for assistant. So I applied for the job. And I used the 2 partners that didn't get along. I used them each. They're both still friends of mine. I love each of them dearly. They just don't like each other. But he told me, it was 2 things I remember from my interview. The first was, he showed me his phone. He said, "I'm retiring in 2.5 years." And it had like the seconds were ticking away of the rest of his career at that point.
Hmm.
He knew he was retiring. And at the time I was like, as an executive assistant, it probably looked pretty good to have a CEO transition on your resume.
Right.
And so that, and then the other thing he told me was, if you can have both of these guys as references, you'll have no problem dealing with me, because he knew both of them as well. And he was like, they're both big personalities and quite different. So that's how I landed at the Ohio Society.
Okay, that's awesome. So what was your career like there?
So when I started, I was Clark's assistant. It's funny, we were talking the other day. Somebody printed off a map. Erin on my team printed off a map because she was going over to Billings to visit people, and she just wanted to know, where to go next. And so when I started there, like one of the things I would do is, when Clark traveled, he had an envelope that he put all his receipts in and tracked his mileage on the outside of it. And like today, like that just seems like the craziest thing you've ever heard in your life. It was a system that worked really well because he had it, and then when he came back, he just handed it to me, and his expenses had it.
Right.
And so, with Clark, I pretty quickly, like, I sat right outside of his office, and I always heard his conversations with folks, and then I picked up on how he managed things and how he
Hmm.
liked things to be. And so from that, I really kind of leveraged that to try and help, that the senior leadership team there get out of their own way. And you talked about Boyd. Boyd was there when I started. So Boyd from Georgia, Chris from South Carolina, and I, all 3 worked together for a while.
Oh, that's funny.
And there were many afternoons where the 3 of us would sit down and just, we'd be talking about whatever the big, initiative that we were working on was. And we would talk about how, certain other folks were either, pulling us away from it, or, not really getting it. And so I just kind of took on, a role of trying to coach people into at the most basic level, not pissing Clark off, but at the highest level, getting them to, get the organization to move together. And so then, I was there for the transition. Clark retires and Scott gets hired. Um, and so onboarding Scott was, quite an adventure. Scott didn't have a history in the accounting profession. And so, he understood how to, run a membership organization and the importance of all of the pieces of that. But he didn't know much about the profession. And
Right.
so probably Scott's first, I don't know, year and a half, 2 years, it was just a lot of, hey, you use this word, that word doesn't mean what you think it means. And just trying to get him, on board. And so I always tell this story. One day, Scott's like, hey, do you want to go to lunch? And Scott and I both, if you ask us to go eat, we're going to say yes.
Yeah.
We're going to eat well, especially when we go together. And so we're sitting down and we're having lunch, and Scott's sitting across from me. He goes, Alan, I think you can do more. And I look at him and go, and you're kind of high maintenance. I'm busting my ass over here just to keep up. And he's like, no, I think you can have an elevated role in the organization. I was like, that sounds a whole lot better than I can afford. And so at that point, we started talking about, long term, what I wanted to do. And I remember at the time just kind of off the cuff saying, oh, I'd love to run one of these things someday. And he was like, well, I mean, if you want to run one of these things, you just got to get the experience. And, luckily you work at one of these things. And so it's fairly easy to do that. And so I ran membership for a couple of years. That was, interesting, just to, get all the logistics of that figured out.
Mhm.
And then we had a piece of software that kind of ran the association. And over time, we had customized it, built all these cool things that it could do that everybody else's version couldn't do. And right about the time we were due for an update, and the folks came to us and they said, all your custom stuff, either it goes in the garbage or you can't update. Like all these things that, security features and all this crap, like it's not going to work with your customization. And so we start this project to re-implement, the software that runs the place. And shortly after that, Chris takes the job in South Carolina. And so our, chief technology officer, right at the beginning of this massive project, he leaves. And so I kind of inherited not the technical work of it, but a lot of the project management of it. And there were, I explain to people this way, that we had to take these custom things out. Most of them were replaced with some stock functionality.
Mhm.
And so there was, a year and a half, 2 years of just going to people and being like, hey, you used to check this box to do that. You now have to check this box to do that. Right? It's the same. Everything works the same. It just looks a little different.
Yeah, exactly.
And at about that same time, my oldest son had started to watch these YouTube videos of people watching other people play video games. Okay. And I remember, like, the first time I saw this, I was like, this is literally the stupidest thing that could ever exist. Okay. We have discovered the dumbest thing possible. But one of the things I learned from hearing this was these people took things that were like amazingly mundane. Like it wasn't even like action games. It was like just
Right.
Minecraft games, but they were super excited about it. And it was like almost impossible not to get excited. So I started, instead of like sitting down with, because the problem was, you had an organization of 40 people. And
Right.
if everybody needed to learn something, you'd get everybody in a room and you'd show them, and that sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And so what I started doing was just self-recording videos. But I would get like super excited about this. And the worst part was we had this open concept office, right? And so I would send the message out, and about 3 minutes later, I would just hear myself. like in 10 different times, like off by a second each one. It would drive me nuts, but everybody loved it. And the nice thing was, since it was recorded, they could watch it again. And so if they
Yeah.
didn't get it, I didn't have to go and explain it a second time. They just press play again and did it all over again. And so that's one of those things that, like, looking back, I took something that I saw that I thought was just the dumbest damn thing I'd ever seen, but I tried to learn from it. So
But you saw how engaging it was.
yeah,
Well, and I think that's important too when we talk about like difference in generations, that a lot of times we think there's only one way to do something. It's the way we know, and we can learn from the younger generation of things that engage them. And then you're like, oh, wait, how do I take this concept and make it work for me? I had a yoga studio, and we did a lot of our communications and everything through Facebook. And my son worked at the studio, and he's like, why are you using Facebook? And I was like, well, that's how we communicate. And he's like, that's for old people. And I was like, well, those are my people. But he's like, you're never going to get people my age here. And I was like, okay, good point. What should we do? And at the time, Snapchat was like a big deal. And he's like, I think it was like geo mapping or something. He's like, I got to do that here so that they see it. And I was like, okay, you're in charge, like that's your, instead of like rejecting, oh, that would never work. It's like his point from his standpoint was valid, and what you can learn as a leader from, sometimes, anyone in the organization, it doesn't have to be a title, so it's a great example.
Yep. So the year I managed, or when I managed membership in Ohio, Laura Owen, who I think she's still there,
Mhm.
she taught me a fantastic lesson one day. I was sitting in my office, and she and the rest of the team, they just sat right outside me, and she was talking to somebody, and she swore, and I was like, oh my God, I can't believe this. She's swearing at a member. And so, I very nervously the next day, I'm like, hey, Laura, can you come here? I'm like, what's the deal? Like, I heard you swearing at this member yesterday. And she's like, well, he swore at me first. And I was like, well, who was it? Who are you talking to? And like, she told me the person's name, and I give him a call, and he's like, yeah, we always swear at each other. That's how our interactions are. And I was like, you know what, that, at the time, this whole concept of, personalization and making things, individualized, wasn't as predominant. And I was like, this is an example where she's got a relationship that she's built over time,
Right.
and she's doing what they do in that relationship. And it's,
Yeah,
you can't judge a conversation from only hearing one side of it.
exactly. So now that you are the executive director at Montana, what lessons do you think you take into your leadership, whether it be from your dad, from Clark, from Scott, from these other managing partners? Like, what things, because I always think we're a quilt, right? We take little things over time and then make it our own. But what were some lessons that you've learned that you've kept?
So I think probably the biggest thing that I try to do, and I try to do it because it's worked well for me. Others have done this to me, and I always appreciated it. And it's not micromanaging. Like,
Mhm.
I've seen folks who micromanage, and I've seen the impact of that. And I've always appreciated when somebody has given me a project and said, get us to this point. Don't do A, B, and C, but get us here. And however that works, do it.
Right.
I think the first example that pops to mind is when I worked at the accounting firm. We created a mentoring program, and so we wanted folks to have, a more senior person they could go to, but somebody that didn't report to. And so I was told just to do it. And, I did some research and figured out, what the mechanics of a good mentorship program are. And then we implemented the program, but it wasn't, I was given that freedom to just make it happen.
Mhm.
And I do my best work if you tell me to do A, B, and C, I'm going to get to B and try and figure out, C to get it done instead.
Right. Yeah. That's awesome. Any other lessons?
Um, I think just curiosity. I don't know if curiosity is a
Hmm.
lesson, but I think over time I've learned that you can make more progress asking questions than you can sharing answers, um,
Hmm.
and that's something that I distinctly remember Clark was fantastic at that. He would ask you to do something, and you'd bring him a prototype of it, and his questions were always just fantastic. And he and Laura at the High Society did the same thing. They knew where they wanted to get you. They wouldn't tell you, but they'd ask you a leading question, and then you would just naturally go where they wanted you to go. And then, like a year later, you'd be like, damn it, I I I never would have gone there. I didn't want to go there. Led in that direction, not by demand, but purely
It
out of
was,
somebody asking a question.
it's also influence,
Yeah,
right? It's gentle influence so that you feel like you are part of getting to that answer.
yeah. And it goes back to they recognized that I didn't like being micromanaged, but they
Hmm.
still wanted to, control my energies. And so they just found that way to do it.
Yeah. Is there anything that you've thought hasn't served you and you've decided as a leader to be intentionally different?
So I think the thing I struggle the most with, and it's funny because when I interviewed for the job, they asked the classic question, what are you not good at, right?
Hmm.
And I said, I have very little experience in advocacy, and so government relations, that whole ball of wax. Um, my my default is to be fairly blunt, and just to the point and less BS. And
Hmm.
I've learned in advocacy that is not the best policy. That's not
Hmm.
that's not how you get things done with legislators or folks like that. And so that is an area where I have recognized a skill I was lacking, and a natural proclivity to do it the wrong way, and just kind of over time, continue to fight myself there.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I was also thinking, like, you being an executive assistant probably did fall in line with your dad being so organized and probably, just methodical and being taught that way as well.
Yep. Well, and
Probably gave you a comfort in that.
yeah, well, and I think the flip side of that, the thing that I've probably taken away the most from my mom is, a lot of home economics, as it was, termed back then, is, you're doing these things to run a household to take care of people. And I think, one of the things I think is really nice is that they've kind of changed that curriculum over time to make it more inwardly focused. And so if you take
Hmm.
home ec today, it's less family planning and more, those soft life skills that you don't learn anywhere else.
Hmm.
And so I think for my mom, I still like inherently just want to take care of people. And I think that,
Hmm.
like, especially working in association, it's a big part of what we do is take care of people.
Yes, absolutely. Awesome. Well, so many great stories and lessons there. So, um, I'd like to end with some rapid fire questions. So, you pick a category, and the category is either family and friends, money, spiritual, or health.
So, having watched my peers, I don't think any of them went with spirit, and
Oh, thank
I
you.
think it is an area. Like as I looked at them all, like the questions were easier to answer in every other category, I think. And
Yes,
so it took a little more thought, but I think I'm ready. I think I'm ready for this one. And
I
the other
love
thing I
it.
would say is people that know me, they're probably like on the edge of their seat at this point to find out, what my thoughts are in this area.
Awesome. All right. So, as far as spiritual, things or actions I don't have that I want.
So this one, and I take spiritual to be a little bit like religious, and the thing I think of is understanding. Like
Hmm.
I'm always envious of people who have like a understanding of like the world through either a religion or a philosophy of some sort. And I don't have that understanding. I feel like I'm still like looking for that.
Yeah. Okay. Um, things or actions that I do have that I want to keep.
Curiosity. This one's easy.
Hmm.
So I don't know, 5, 6 years ago, I'd never read the Bible. So I just read the Bible because I was curious. You hear all the stories.
Hmm.
I'm right now reading the Book of Mormon. My board chair is, Church of
Not the
Latter-day Saints.
musical.
Yeah, and so
Okay.
um, I was talking to him at our retreat last year, and just kind of said, I read the Bible, and he's like, "Well, have you read the Book of Mormon?" And I'm like, "No," and he's like, "Would you like to?" And I was like, "Yes." And so he had one, he gave it to me, and I'm working my way through it.
Well, that's awesome. And I think that's important because then you see the through lines and all the different spiritualities, right? Of what makes everyone in common too.
Yeah.
Um, things or actions I don't have that I don't want.
Blind faith. Too many.
Hmm.
I know too many people that like
Hmm.
they're stuck to their they're brought up in a religion and they don't question it at all. That scares me.
Yeah. And not take time to learn about others. Yeah, absolutely. Things or actions that I do have that I don't want.
Skepticism. I'm highly skeptical of all of these things, and I wish I wasn't. I wish I could latch onto something and embrace it. But I'm always skeptical.
And that probably goes along with curiosity, right?
Yep.
Because there's any scientist is probably skeptical, like with research, and you have to like uncover the reason why or why not. So yeah, that totally makes sense. Well, thanks for going for a different category.
You're welcome. It's funny. Somebody was asking me, like describe like your view of like life and afterlife. And one of the things it's funny because a couple of weeks ago I saw something and I was like, that's it. I don't know if you've seen Everything Everywhere All at Once, the movie.
Mm-mm.
It's this multi-dimensional thing where like every decision you make branches into two different like universes. Um,
Okay.
and I think just intrinsically, when I look at the night sky, I think there's no end to that. And if there's no
Yeah,
end to that, that means everything is happening somewhere. Um,
exactly.
and so I think that like, it's a fantastic movie. There are a couple of highly raunchy scenes in it, but overall, good movie, good story.
That's awesome. Well, is there anything that you want to make sure that you emphasize or that we didn't cover today that you want to leave people with?
I think one of the things we didn't touch on today that I'd like to have people think about is more isn't necessarily better.
Hmm.
Um, I think if you can find your place in this world and just accept life as it is. Um,
Hmm.
I've found myself to be a lot happier when I am accepting of my circumstances than when I feel like I have to try and grow or be something that I'm not.
Hmm.
That's my
I
advice.
love that.
When people ask me when they uh, interview for a job, I'm always like, be yourself, because if they hire you and you were somebody else in the interview, you've got to be that other person when they hire you.
Right. Else they're like, who did we just hire? Yeah.
Yeah. And so if you want
Yeah.
to be yourself, which I think is something we should all want, um,
Exactly.
then you have to be yourself. And a lot
Yeah.
of people aren't going to like that, but the people that matter will like that.
Exactly. Well, I love that. Well, thank you so much for taking this time to share your story and so many great leadership lessons in here as well. And I also look forward to being part of your conference in June. So it's going to be awesome. And we're doing yoga there as well. So people can get present before they go into their session that day.
Yeah. Well, we're excited to have you this year, and can't wait to show Montana to you.
Well, thank you. I am excited as well. So I will see you soon, and thank you very much for being on today.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And now for my mindful moments on this interview that I had with Alan, where he talked about the small town he lived in growing up, where his dad originally had been in the Navy and a truck driver when they moved to Ohio so that he could be a CAD designer as an engineer. And he did this very early on in his career, was very organized and methodical, which were traits that definitely stuck with Alan throughout him growing up as well as into his career. Where his mom was a school teacher and his uncles were school teachers too. So he went to a private school outside of the public school where his mom taught. But he came from a very close knit family, and his parents actually met when they lived across the street from each other their entire life. And so the grandparents were close, the family was close knit. And he really learned how to keep himself busy growing up, being in a small town that was about 3 miles radius, that gave him traits as he's grown into adult to keep himself present and to not want to be rushed, that, things take time and to have patience with the people around you. He talked about the important things that he learned from being in a small town of just appreciating when things move slower. And when he lived in Columbus, whether it was through college or some of his career as well, that the pace was very different. And he didn't realize that moving now to Montana and being responsible for the Montana Society, how much that really brought his back his small town ideals and how he really enjoys life. And sometimes we don't often notice when we appreciate certain things from our childhood that maybe we've gotten away from. And then when we have those observations of making sure that we bring those things back into our life, even in small ways, if we need to learn to meditate or slow down or things like that, so that we can create that feeling, that bliss of what he felt of being from a small town. The other thing that was really important to him about being from a small town was community. And just being able to inherently trust people. Being from a small town, you know most of the people around you, you know their families. And so it does make it easier to trust versus in a big town when you're not sure who to trust. And really understanding of how you build that trust as a community is really important, whether that's through friendships, family, or even in business. So we talked about his career and also him graduating in business administration, but really moving into being an executive assistant. And what he even talks about being one of a few men that were an executive assistant at the time. And I think we forget how far we've come with this kind of diversity or even stereotyping or profiling certain roles like he described in this interview, and how he had to gain acceptance as a man as an executive assistant and gain trust and respect as well, that I think is really important. And one of the things he talked about, and I do think this has come up as well when I talk to accounting firms too, just about learning, is how you take the stuff that you learn inside of an office that's ancillary that you learn from, and how you do that in this remote world. Because he used an example about how he learned a lot from Clark Price when he was working for the Ohio Society, because he was sitting outside of his office and he heard different conversations or how Clark handled certain things. And it also gave him knowledge in how to help others in the organization be able to achieve the outcomes that they wanted, because he knew from watching Clark and listening to Clark what things were going to help influence him to get to where everyone wanted to go. And I think that's an important thing that we all need to think about, is how do we take some of those interactions or learnings that aren't formalized education that we got in an office atmosphere or in real life, and how do we take that into remote life and make sure that people are still learning these things and creating ways that everything doesn't have to be so scheduled, and people can listen into things or shadow things so that they do learn different people's styles. And one of the things that I thought was so great when he was talking about really engaging people in the process is when he learned from his son that was watching different YouTube videos about something that they thought was really boring. But in the way that those YouTube videos were created, with the excitement and enthusiasm, you couldn't help but watch it. And he used that kind of lesson in the way that he created learning for other people in the organization and making recordings where it got people to watch or wait for the next one. And I think that's important, that we don't always do what's expected, that we try to find ways that are engage people. And in this time of being in this remote world, how important that is. So some of the lessons that he learned along the way that I think are really important to call out here from other leaders that became his own belief systems was, number one, not to micromanage, just let people know where you want to go and then give them the freedom to get there in the way that they can get there. Obviously, you need to put guardrails on that and deadlines and so forth, and benchmarks, but giving people that freedom to explore, which brings to the second thing of curiosity. And staying curious is a really important skill set that a lot of people lose as they go up the ranks, because everyone becomes so sure of themselves or sure of their answers that they lose that curiosity of maybe there's another way, or maybe it is possible. And it's, we tried it a couple years ago, but now let's look at it again. It's a different time. Too many times people get crushed when they have new ideas and they're just told it's always been this way, or that won't work because we tried that before, instead of allowing a new approach and being curious. He also talked about that, what he learned from his mom about really taking care of others, of how important that is in team building, but also relationship building, with your customers or clients or members, whoever that is a really important part that we shouldn't get away from as we move through the leadership ranks. So this was a great interview, and so many great takeaways that Allen described, and the stories he described about his life, that, really just getting back to that mentality of being present and being able to be still. And that is something that I definitely talk about in my new book, Disconnect to Connect, Tap into the Power Within You to Create the Life You Desire. Is sometimes we're racing through life, that we have these career aspirations or family aspirations or whatever it is in our mind that we're running toward, but we're not actually present in the life that we're in. And we're not actually taking the time to enjoy life as it is today. And so these are really the lessons that Allen's talking about, that my book's talking about, that so many leaders have talked about on here, is that there is no rush. And life is really a journey, and the lessons that we learn about ourselves when we take those moments to step back, to research, to continually learn and expand ourselves, not only make us better, but also creates better energy for those around us. So I hope you enjoyed this interview, and I also hope you'll go out and buy my new book. It is launching April 25th, and that is Disconnect to Connect, Tap into the Power Within You to Create the Life You Desire. We're going to have a new podcast series coming up this summer where I'm going to break down the book chapter by chapter. So definitely get your copy. Definitely let us know what your questions are so that I can address them as we go through that podcast series. Thank you so much for listening, and definitely share and rate this podcast so others will know about it as well.
Thank you for taking the time out of your day to listen to the Breaking Beliefs podcast. I hope you will take a moment to pause before entering back into your day to reflect on this podcast and note 1 to 2 actions you are inspired to do from today's conversation that you could incorporate into your life. To read the full blog and listen back to this episode or any other, you can find them at www.amyvetter.com/Breaking Beliefs podcast and related videos on my YouTube channel. For daily inspiration, follow me on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn at Amy Vetter CPA. I hope that you will choose to like this and subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, and more, so that you can join us for more inspiration on our next episode.